first presenter today is Mr. Ron Insana. You know him from CNBC. He has been covering the world of business since 1984. And he has been on CNBC. He hosted Street Signs. He has been everywhere. He's written 4 books. He is a man for whom I really don't need to spend very much time on an introduction. He is here to talk about whether or not Fortress America is still intact. So to introduce Mr. Insana, let's...
Thank you very much for having me. I do appreciate it. I thought the governor and lieutenant governor's comments were quite important, quite instructive with respect to where we are in the national and global economy today, and I will get to that. I should point out, Steve made it very clear to me last night that I was not his first choice to speak with you this morning. They wanted Jim Cramer, but today's Jim's medication holiday, so he can't be here. Bring up to date on the news last night. I don't know if I don't know what you guys were doing last night, but the New York Times broke a story about how President Trump tried to fire Robert Mueller, and were it not for his chief counsel Don McGahn refusing to carry out the order in June and threatening to step down, that they would have gone forward and fired the special counsel. This morning, the Washington Post is running a story that Vice President Pence has offered to resign in the wake of this revelation, and the Dow futures are down about 500 points in early trade today. Was indicated earlier to open up. That's not true. It's early. I'm just trying to make sure you're with me this morning. Sorry. When you spend 34 years on TV, people have a tendency to believe whatever you say. I have spent the last several years talking about this concept of Fortress America, and I'll get to that. I'll give you a little more background on my career, that being kind of one of the, as I said, seminal moments in the development of my views on markets and economics. But as Mike had suggested, I started at Financial News Network directly out of college in 1984. I was a film major in Southern California, where I spent a good 17 years of my life. And upon graduation, neither Steven Spielberg nor George Lucas bothered to call me. And so without gainful employment, a friend of mine from high school got me an entry-level position at Financial News Network, which in 1984 was in about 12 million American homes, half of which were distributed on cable. And for those of you old enough to remember this, the other half were UHF stations around the country, ultra-high frequency stations that were the very small competitors to your 2, 4s, and 7s around the nation when we were really operating in a 3-channel environment. And so we had very loose distribution agreements. It was a pretty small operation, but we were running as a full network. So we had a full group of anchors, reporters, and so on and so forth. And I went there as a production assistant, $50 a day, freelance, no benefits, straight out of college. It barely paid my monthly car bill. And about 4 months into my experience there, after ripping wire when we had paper wires and tearing scripts when we had paper script sets, my executive producer came up to me and said, "Remember when I told you I needed you next week? I don't need you next week." So I was summarily dismissed, went back to the vitamin store where I worked in college. A week after that, our assignment editor called me up and said, "Listen, come on down. We're having a party. They're closing the entire place down," which was not entirely true. They were letting go 95% of the editorial staff. So we had this goodbye party. FNN was spending $1 million a month and taking in $500,000, and they decided to go break even overnight. So they let go almost everybody. They retained Bill Griffith and Sue Herrera. That was, by the way, Bill Griffith, who you saw there throwing to me in Chicago. And Bill and Sue were the only anchors that they kept. My friend Casey stayed on as one of, I think, 2 producers at the time. And for the next 4 months, they operated that way. Bill and Sue were ad-libbing 8 hours of live business television between them every day. And I think Casey wrote headlines and did a handful of other things. 4 months later, he called me up and asked me if I wanted his job as a producer. So they were offering me $22,500 a year and benefits, so I went back. And about 3 months after that, Bill and Sue had now been on the air 6 months, every day, 8 hours a day, no scripts, ad-libbing the entire day between them. They both called in sick on the same day. And an enterprising young producer gave me my first chance to go on air, read a couple of updates. The fact that I was that producer is probably immaterial for the purposes of this conversation, but I was the only person in the room, and so I'd done a couple of practice runs and got on the air for a day. 3 months later, I was on full-time. They brought a co-anchor in for me, and by September of 1985, I was a full-time anchor, never having studied economics and never having studied broadcast journalism. So at the ripe old age of 24, I was on the air 2 hours a day, not knowing what I was doing and not knowing what I was saying. For those of you who watch cable television today, not much has changed in the last 30 years. But it was a fascinating experience, and the more deeply involved we got into the content, the more interesting it became. And our primary mission was to explain, and you can understand this, we had a whole agricultural department. We did ag weather in the mornings and things like that. But we were trying to explain why markets mattered and to put it into English so that whatever people at home were watching our channel, they would understand why markets mattered and how markets could affect the broad general economy. And over time, that became a much more refined process through our merger with CNBC. That experience that you saw there when I was reporting from the Chicago Board Options Exchange was entirely, again, somewhat serendipitous insofar as I was out in Chicago that week visiting a friend of mine who was in medical school at Northwestern. And I asked Bill Griffith if I could do a live report from the Chicago Board Options Exchange because we did a show with them every Monday morning at 10:30 Eastern Time. And Bill said yes. He let me go out and do it. I was going to take an options trading class. And so we had the CBOE, we had the Merck, and we had the Board of Trade, with which you're quite familiar. And so I was really just going to do one hit and leave. And it turned out that that morning that I showed up there was October 19th, 1987, the day of the biggest stock market crash in the history of the United States. Still, it is the largest single day, percentage decline. That day we were down 23%, roughly. 508 points, when 508 points mattered. And it was a cataclysmic experience. And Alan Greenspan, who had just literally been named chairman of the Federal Reserve in August of 1987 when the Dow hit its all-time high for that period, which, by the way, a rather quaint number now. On August 25th, 1987, the Dow topped out at 2,722. And then promptly fell 1,000 points over 3 months. Again, 23% of that coming in a single day. And instead of doing just one report at the CBOA, I spent the entire week in Chicago covering the crash from the Options Exchange, the Mercantile Exchange, and the Board of Trade. So another true learning experience for me. That was my first live reporting experience ever in my career on the day of the crash. So it was a formative moment. For Alan Greenspan, it was a formative moment as well. He immediately reliquefied the entire economy. The Fed cut interest rates. And that policy of intervention that the Fed undertook that week set a pattern for 30 years of Federal Reserve behavior that carried us through this most recent crisis, where the Fed was extraordinarily aggressive, driving interest rates to zero, pushing long-term interest rates down with a variety of unconditional policies, and really keeping us from going into a Great Depression. So I spent in the post-2008, 2009 period talking a lot about what exactly the Fed did and how it prevented us from going into another Great Depression. As deep as this recession was, it could have been, believe it or not, considerably worse. When you read Ben Bernanke's book, he argues we were 48 hours away from, in late 2008, early 2009, a systemic global financial collapse. Mervyn King, who was the head of the Bank of England at that same time, said it was something more like 3 hours at one of the critical days in which banks were collapsing around the world. So all these interventions propped up the economy, and then we had what has been so far, and many would identify this as a somewhat unsatisfying recovery, but by 2013, 2014, we had taken out a lot of the highs that we'd seen in the economy in 2007. And at this juncture, we're considerably bigger in terms of economic size. GDP is meaningfully larger than it was at the last peak in 2007. Retail sales, auto sales, global trade have all recovered to pre-2007 levels, including the United States, led by the United States. It's only in the last year that the rest of the world has caught up with us. Now we're growing slightly more slowly than the rest of the world at this juncture, but we led the global economy out of the Great Recession, and now we're starting to lag a little bit relative to China, Europe, and Japan, but the whole world is growing simultaneously, which is why we've seen, actually in many ways, some dramatic moves in our labor markets, where the unemployment rate is the lowest in 17 years. As the governor said, that's true nationally. The state rate here is lower than the national rate at 4.1%, but jobless claims are at the lowest level in 45 years. Car sales are still running at a 17 million unit annual rate after having run at 18 million units last year. The only area that has lagged is actually housing construction and sales. Home prices are above their 2007 peak. And while this recovery was taking place, and the reason I started focusing on the Fortress America concept about 3 years ago, was that during this period of repair, balance sheet repair at the federal level, at the corporate level, at the household level, a lot of things were happening in the U.S. economy that people weren't really paying attention to. If you go back to 2008, when oil prices were at $147 a barrel, we were talking about something called peak oil. The notion that the world was simply running out of crude oil and that prices could easily go to $200 or more, gasoline could go to $4 to $5 per gallon, and instead the fracking revolution, with which everyone in the Midwest and through the South is familiar with, has now put the United States in a position where this year we will match Saudi Arabian production. We have the largest proven reserves of oil in the world, surpassing both Saudi Arabia and Russia. We're the largest producer of natural gas. That happened 2 years ago for the first time in history when we overtook Russia. We're a net exporter of refined crude oil products, about to be a net exporter of liquefied natural gas and crude itself. This fracking revolution has been extraordinarily important, and as a transition towards, as the governor said earlier, a more let's say, economically stable form of energy, natural gas being maybe the largest transitional form. This is an extremely important moment because the U.S. has become extremely, not independent, but much more self-sufficient on the energy front, which is inviting manufacturing firms back into the United States. So of the 5 pillars that I looked at with respect to Fortress America, the first being energy self-sufficiency, maybe even independence when you look across North America. A manufacturing renaissance. We are seeing companies come home for a variety of reasons. The president talks about this a lot, but this has been taking place now for a while. The cost of manufacturing in the U.S. in the last several years has become extraordinarily competitive, particularly because the energy inputs have fallen so dramatically. Natural gas at $3, the largest feedstock for manufacturing, that input cost has fallen. It's about a quarter of the price of what you pay in Europe and about an eighth of the price of what you pay in Asia. So rather than shipping things overland and overseas from China, we've now seen technology companies focus more on the United States, bringing back production to match ideation. So there's no geographical or no time difference between the processes, and it's gotten cheaper. And then beyond that, we've of course seen technological innovation in the United States that has moved at an extraordinarily rapid pace in the last several years. And it's a variety of things, as you know, in the agricultural community, whether it's GMO, whether it's changes in machinery and changes in production systems. That's one of the areas in which technology is accelerating. Certainly in communications technology, the iPhone, which was introduced now 10 years ago, was thought not to be possible in the year 2000. When the internet bubble burst, most analysts, most experts said we would not see a killer app again in our lifetime, and instead we went to the iPod, the iPad, and the iPhone, which has radically altered the technological landscape. Then you had social media on top of that. You have 3D printing, which is radically altering manufacturing and even healthcare. Getting back to the social media aspect of it, I am the proud owner of 3 millennials, and so I have seen the impact of some of these technological changes up close and personal. My oldest daughter, who is a sophomore in college, before I speak, always sends me the number of Snapchats she has either sent or received in the last 5.5 years. As of this morning, it is 365,008. If you average that out on a daily basis, that is 172 per day, with the same 3 facial expressions, I might add. Tongue out to the left, tongue out to the right, and then the pursed lips they call duck face with a little caption underneath. It got to the point where things were so absurd that when she was having sleepovers, she would text the girl in bed next to her, which I found maddening. And so at one juncture, I collected the technology and said, you have to speak to each other face to face. And I was walking out of the room, and she said, well, you know, you text mom when you're in bed. And I said, it's none of your business. I'm in a different room. But let's move on. My wife hates that joke, just as an official aside. But, you know, we have seen really transformative technologies overtake the economy. And the millennial crowd, the Gen X crowd, is going to see a radically different economy than the one in which we grew up, just as our economy was radically different from the greatest generation. My parents happen to be part of that particular cohort in the population. And things change, and they're changing as rapidly as we have ever seen. When you look at a chart of technological and economic progress that's taken place over the history of the world, and you can go back as far as you like, both technological innovation and economic improvement, the bulk of it has occurred in the last 100 years. When you look at these charts, you'll see a flat line until about 1900 and then a spike up. That includes technological innovation, that includes economic progress, higher standards of living globally, life expectancy going up. Another feature of the United States that until the last 2 years has been a big benefit. Our life expectancies until 2 years ago when the opioid crisis hit was moving up at exponential rates. We were moving up about 2 months in life expectancy every 2 months. And one of the kind of interesting features of the U.S. was that the longer you live, the longer you're expected to live. So as you get to 65, if you've cleared some of the kind of threats to your health, you're an odds-on bet to live to be 81. If you're 81, you're expected to go into your 90s. And so that longevity trade, if you will, is still on. It's been temporarily interrupted by the opioid crisis, which, believe it or not, has bent the life expectancy curve in the United States in the last 2 years, something that obviously we need to deal with. But in the longer run, I suspect that's going to be a temporary phenomenon, and we'll go back to a situation in which demographically the U.S. is quite strong relative to the rest of the world, insofar as the millennials are now the largest population cohort in the United States. They overtook the baby boomers, last year. So there's 77 million millennials. There's 77-ish million baby boomers who are very quickly, aging into retirement. And so we're seeing now a barbell in our population that simply doesn't exist in most other developed countries. Europe is aging faster than we are. Japan is going into irreversible population decline. They're going to lose about 20 million people net in the next 20 years unless they were to have some sort of massive baby boom explosion, which is highly unlikely, given that they now have more centenarians than they have births. So unless their behavior has radically changed or their immigration policies change, the U.S. is still in that regard in the driver's seat, assuming our immigration policies remain somewhat enlightened. Obviously, that's a challenged position at the moment, but we'll have to see what the longer run looks like. And then finally, we've had, one would argue until recently, political stability relative to the rest of the world. When you look at Europe not being able to forge a consensus on a variety of issues, you look at Japan having been stuck really for the last 20, almost 30 years now, debating economic policy, or even China, which has its own political and economic issues, the U.S. has been better positioned. Now, we do face some challenges going forward, which is something that I've begun to focus on in the last several weeks, if not the last several months, is that we have some issues as the economy is now accelerating for a variety of different reasons. Number one, at full employment, we have surplus jobs and a shortage of workers. There are 6.1 million open jobs in the United States. That is a record, and most executives that I talk to can't fill the positions that they have. Now, immigration is, the debate over immigration is exacerbating that problem because we have seen fewer people come to the U.S. Tourism is down roughly 4%. 40,000 jobs have been lost because fewer people have come to the U.S. in the last year, owing to political attitudes that are prevailing at the moment. But we also have a problem, as the governor was suggesting, about education and retraining, where we simply don't have enough highly skilled workers to fill some of these jobs. In fact, we don't have enough low-skilled workers or semi-skilled workers. We have shortages of agricultural workers, as you well know. We have shortages of welders. We have shortages of teachers. And we have shortages of nurses. So if the economy were to accelerate from here, thanks to the tax reform that was mentioned earlier, it's possible that we could overheat. Wage inflation would accelerate, and that would force the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates more quickly than we currently anticipate. And that could usher in not only a correction in the stock market, but possibly a recession if the Fed felt that inflation was going to accelerate too far beyond its 2% target. So that's one area of concern that has kind of got my attention insofar as it's an outlier. It's not what the market is pricing in. Certainly the market's pricing in a very gradual increase in interest rates from the Fed, but we could be throwing gasoline on the fire right now, and the economy could accelerate to such an extent, both domestically and globally, that central banks around the world will tighten faster than they had planned as recently as December of 2017. There is also the falling dollar, which is very helpful to your industry, but in a certain sense may be a canary in the coal mine insofar as the stock market's going through the roof, but the dollar has now fallen for about 13 consecutive months to a 3.5-year low. Sometimes that's good insofar as it promotes U.S. exports, it increases multinational profits, generally a good thing, but it could also be a warning that other countries have taken a different view of the viability of U.S. investment. In which case, if we were to see China, if indeed we enter a trade war with them, as Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross suggested yesterday in Davos, if we were to get into a tit-for-tat trade war with China, they could sell bonds and dollars, and that would create an economic disruption that we're not planning on. And so that's an area that I'm focused on quite closely. The second area, obviously, is political instability in the United States. Given the revelations, again, that New York Times story, by the way, last night was true. The parts that I added this morning were not. That the president tried to fire or wanted to fire Bob Mueller back in June, and Don McGahn threatened to resign. If this investigation were to accelerate and cause a constitutional crisis of some sort, we would see a disruption in the marketplace. Now, I also happen to believe that there's something I'll call a Pence put underneath the market. I think the financial markets wouldn't care all that much if Mike Pence became president of the United States, because he might even be a more effective shepherd of conservative policies, if you will, than President Trump, with fewer distractions and maybe more successes, in which case that would, again, from a market and economic perspective, be a net positive. But we'd have to get through that period of uncertainty if indeed it comes to pass. Then there's geopolitical risk. And the two areas that I'm focused on, obviously first, is North Korea. We don't know what's going to happen there. We don't know if we'll do what they've called a punch-in-the-nose preemptive strike to suggest to Kim Jong-un we won't tolerate further nuclear development, in which case we would do something in conventional warfare designed to at least limit his capability to fire ICBMs or launch more sophisticated rockets and weaponry that could carry nuclear payloads, or we do nothing, or we continue to negotiate at the same time that we're having a trade war potentially with China, whom we need to negotiate with the North Koreans. We're in a rather precarious position, and just comments yesterday from North Korea suggested they are within months of having a missile that could strike the United States. And we saw that false alarm in Hawaii, which touched off a bit of a crisis a few days ago. We probably can't afford another one of those, particularly if it were real. That's obvious. And the reason, according to many former government officials, that we have not attacked North Korea in the last several administrations is that a conventional military response from North Korea on South Korea would kill 120,000 South Koreans per 2 hours, because they have rockets trained on Seoul that take 45 seconds to get from the mountains of southern North Korea into downtown Seoul. We also have 30,000 American troops in the DMZ, and so that would be a large-scale conventional war that Russia and China would support from the north. We, of course, would be supporting the south, and that could turn into something that is incalculable. And so it's a low probability event, but it's a risk that we have to pay attention to, just as heightened tensions in the Middle East could drive oil prices substantially higher. We're seeing a radical regime change in Saudi Arabia. Some may view it as positive, but there is going to be a battle for regional hegemony between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Whether that takes place as a proxy war in Lebanon, where the Saudis, the Israelis, and the U.S. go after Hezbollah there, and the Iranians support it, remains to be seen. But it is a heightened risk, and I think one of the reasons why we've seen oil prices rise as much as they have in recent months. There does seem to be a geopolitical risk premium in the price of oil that hasn't been present for quite some time. So those are the things I've largely focused on going forward as risks. Again, they're not high probability events, but they're things we can't afford to ignore. So as you look over the course of 2018, one assumes that at least for the next several months, the economy continues strong. We got our fourth quarter GDP print this morning. It's 2.6% annual growth. It was a little short of expectations, but still solid enough to improve the job market and maintain a decent pace of growth here in the U.S. as the rest of the world accelerates. We do have trade risk as well, which is important to you. And we have risks embedded in the political process when it comes to the Farm Bill, which is stuck and is being contemplated with a variety of changes, whether it's reductions in the food stamp or Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program known as SNAP. They're talking about cutting $7 to $10 billion out of that. And so as a consequence, the Farm Bill, insofar as the overall budget process is in limbo right now, the Farm Bill is also an open question as to how it's going to be constructed and what the U.S. is going to do to continue to support the agricultural community, which is entirely dependent not only on domestic consumption but trade, which is being treated radically differently in the Trump administration than in prior administrations. Peter Navarro and Bob Lighthizer, who are two senior trade representatives, are willing to enter trade wars with China, potentially blow up NAFTA. Again, a low probability event, but it's a rather contentious set of conversations right now, which would not be helpful to your community. And to the extent that you can press your elected representatives to be level-headed about this, I think would be important. We don't know where we stand in the NAFTA negotiation. The president doesn't seem to focus on integrated supply chains, on how the North American Free Trade Agreement really works with respect to winners and losers. If you go back to 1993, the implementation of NAFTA, trilateral trade among Canada, the United States, and Mexico was $300 billion. Today it's $1 trillion. We are not a net loser. We're a net beneficiary of NAFTA. There are things that need to be fixed, none of which have yet been identified really by the administration. They talk a lot about domestic content rules for cars. It would be very difficult in the current environment to rearrange the supply chain to enhance or increase the amount of domestic content that goes into an automobile. It is a global supply chain that's it would be extremely difficult to disrupt, if not cause serious economic problems, both domestically and around the world. So trade's another, I would say, the fourth, and in many cases, the most important aspect of what we're watching right now with respect directly to the economy. A disruption in trade, a trade war, protectionist measures, increasing tariffs, as we've already seen on Chinese solar panels and South Korean washing machines, could set off the type of arrangement in which global trade grinds to a halt. We saw that in the 1930s in its extreme form, and we've seen it at other points in more modern economic history, but it's a danger to the economy. So those are the things that I'm keeping an eye on. My longer-term perspective, of course, is still quite positive. The U.S. is still at the forefront of many of these things. China is catching us to a certain extent on innovative new technologies, but betting against the United States, as Warren Buffett has said many times, is a fool's errand. We have seen over the course of the intervening years since the crisis a rather dour view of the United States, that we were somehow in decline. It got so bad at one juncture on cable television, there are now 270 reality television programs, 260 of which deal with the Kardashians. But there was one, interestingly enough, some years back called Doomsday Preppers, and it was a group of individuals who went out into the woods with canned foods and guns, and they built these impenetrable forces in the event that President Obama came for their guns, or the black ships were coming, or the end of days were around the corner. And it was an interesting idea, and if they were right about that with respect to where we were going, there should have been only one episode of the program. It lasted for 5 seasons. So when you're betting on the end of the world, it is a one-way bet. And if you're right, it happens one time and you don't get paid. So it really doesn't make sense, particularly in the United States, to make that bet. So on that note, I'd like to make this more interactive conversation. We have some microphones floating around. I will go so far. And that, by the way, in the other picture was real hair. But there was a period in my career where CNBC forced me to wear a hairpiece for 3 years. I still talk about that publicly. It is therapeutic for me. And as I look around the room, some of you may benefit from my experience as well. So feel free to fire away. We have a little time left, and be happy to chat at your convenience.
Trade war, we could see global trade grind to a halt. We saw it happen in the 1930s. In the 1930s, people in America, at least, were much more self-sufficient. We didn't need to trade globally.
Right.
Can we theoretically see global trade grind to a halt given the integrated supply chains we have?
It depends how dogmatic people get. I mean, again, Lighthizer and Peter Navarro are really kind of ground into a philosophical perspective. And the president talked about this in Davos this morning. Free trade, fair trade, reciprocity without a fear of imposing tariffs on goods from other countries. When you get to that level, and it's interesting the timing of this, that we would impose tariffs on Chinese solar panels and South Korean washing machines when we need both countries to deal with North Korea. It's not a fully thought out proposition. So you can veer off in a direction that can be damaging to the global economy. And the way the U.S. is constructed now, the inputs from all around the world are so important to the final stage of manufacturing. We do a lot of value-added manufacturing in the United States. We do a lot of high-tech. So I think it's important that cooler heads prevail and that they find ways to negotiate, whether it's bilateral or multilateral trade agreements, that we do so in a way that's not disruptive. And yes, I do think the global economy could grind, not to a full halt, but certainly to a meaningful one, yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm Bob Riley. You talked a little bit about the somewhat enlightened immigration policies that we have, which I'm trying to.
No, I was not talking about now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't.
You know, Iowa's in a terrible spot in terms of immigration. We have the same issue as Japan.
Yeah.
Older people, low birth rate. How do you see that playing out, and can we pick and choose or cherry pick the people that we want to come to this state to help us in our labor problems?
Well, I'm not sure you can cherry pick, and it's interesting because we're talking now, I should say the Trump administration is talking about a merit-based program for immigration. I don't know what that means, and if you go back through history and you read literature about immigration waves in the United States, they all read the same. We brought Chinese people in the 1860s and 70s to build the railroad, then passed the Chinese Exclusion Act and sent them back to China. If you read any literature from the 1830s and 1840s, Irish immigrants were low class, they had no merit, they had no right to be here because the natives, and again, I was watching Gangs of New York last night, which is as sloppy a movie as it is historically, it does capture the sentiment right. There was a piece by a gentleman in the Atlantic, Francis A. Walker, who wrote in 1895 about the wave of inferior people who were coming from Italy, Germany, Russia, Jews who were coming over from Eastern Europe, and others who were detracting from American society and were of a different breed than, it's interesting that they refer to themselves at the time as Native Americans when you have to go back 14, 15,000 years to really identify that group of individuals. And it's been the same argument with every ethnic group that's ever come. So I really don't understand the anti-immigration stance. Our birth rate has rolled over a bit in the last couple of years. It's now 1.87 children per woman. You need 2.1 to replace your population. So that to the extent that economic growth is equal to the growth of the labor force plus productivity growth, that gives you GDP. If the labor force contracts, you can't reach 3%. You can't grow your way out of these problems. You can't find agricultural workers. And again, understand the context in which I say this, but we have a shortage of low-skilled, semi-skilled, and highly skilled workers. Part of it is a problem of education and training in the United States, where we have left an entire generation behind because we haven't adequately prepared them for advanced manufacturing. We haven't prepared them necessarily for technology. Our kids are ready. The notion that we have to take under 20-year-olds and teach them technology is, having 3 kids in that age cohort, is absolutely absurd. My kids are so fluent in technology they could teach their teachers how to code. And this is, you know, it's like us with a television set in 1965. You know, I was the technological genius in my house because I was the remote. You know, my dad would not get out of that leather chair to save his life, so I got up and changed to 2, 4, and 7, adjusted the rabbit ears, and somehow I was, you know, a technological genius. You know, my kids are, my son, who's 16, is a self-taught music composer and producer on his computer, and he has learned every one of these programs on his own and knows more than most people that I've seen in tech. We don't have to worry about our kids. We have to worry about the generation of coal miners who should not be being retrained to go back into coal. West Virginia had a very interesting program underway a few months ago to retrain these individuals to become welders. And as President Trump started talking up coal, a lot of them dropped out of the program with the hope that they'd go back to the mines. So education and retraining for the cohort that's been left behind is important. Immigration's extremely important if we want a vibrant workforce that meets the needs of a modern economy at the low end, middle, and high end of the, let's say, manufacturing or economic spectrum. Absolutely.
Now, Ron, we've got a question here in the back there.
What was the first part? Was it the midterms?
Italian elections.
Oh, Italian elections. Listen, Italy's gotten very interesting because, like Spain, which is dealing, well, first there's Brexit. Spain's dealing with a secessionist movement still in Catalonia. There are some wealthier parts of Italy that want to break away from the country. So Italy's in an interesting position insofar as they're among the largest debtors in Europe with the debt to GDP ratio that's well in excess of 200%. Berlusconi wants to control the process. Rather interestingly, there are a lot of Italians who support him irrespective of his past indiscretions, if you will. They've had an influx of immigrants, and when you talk to some people who are either here from Italy, they, like some other countries in Europe, are turning anti-immigrant. And so I think it's an open question. Renzi's out of the picture. Berlusconi is trying either to become president again or pull the strings on this. And we'll see. I don't know what the outcome is, but it is problematic insofar as that Italy, Spain, and Portugal and Greece, the peripheral countries of Europe, are still economically troubled. And they're now having this populist wave that we've seen here and in other parts of the world take over. So, open question. They may want a Trump-like character, and that would be Berlusconi. Whether he becomes de facto leader of Italy or pulling the strings behind the scenes may be a relatively high probability event, and then you'll see some interesting changes in Italy. With respect to, I'm sorry, the second part was?
Interest rates.
Interest rates. Yeah, listen, if we accelerate and if the inflation rate starts to meaningfully move above the Fed's 2% target, or they believe that it will, we'll see a faster pace of increases and maybe a faster reduction in the size of the Fed's balance sheet, which would push up long-term interest rates. And we've seen a little bit of that lately. And that comes from stronger than expected growth, labor markets that are very, very tight nationally, and that could prompt the Fed. And we have a new regime at the Fed, we should point out. In February, Jay Powell takes over. We have a wildly different composition of the Fed than we've had in prior periods. The Greenspan, Bernanke, Yellen era is effectively over. So they may favor deregulation. You can get an overheating economy and a financial sector that starts to take risks that they, over the last several years, have not been allowed to take. That could be a complicating factor because the Fed may lay off on the regulatory side as well. So it's going to be interesting, and I think we'll know. Jay Powell will be addressing Congress in the semi-annual economic report, I believe. Well, no, I guess Janet Yellen will have that. We won't hear from Jay Powell until after February when he sits in Janet Yellen's chair. But we're going to have to very closely watch the composition of the Fed as it's being refilled, and we'll have to watch his public remarks to see if he deviates from this notion of gradual rate increases and a gradual reduction in the size of the Fed's balance sheet. If he were to get more aggressive, we'd see an instant response in the market, and that would have a negative feedback impact on the overall economy down the road.
Looks like we've got time for about one more question. Do we have anybody with a microphone in hand?
There's a gentleman over there.
Oh, perfect. Just shout it out. We'll repeat it.
Yeah, generally speaking, oh, sure. The question is about the U.S. debt, the implications for rising debt. The tax bill, of course, could add as much as $1.4 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years. It comes at a rather interesting juncture because the Fed has kept rates so low that the debt service burden in the United States has been minimal, even as the Fed was buying bonds. That was also a very big deal. The Fed was taking bond supply out of the market, keeping interest rates, one would argue artificially but necessarily low during our period of recovery. If the Fed starts raising rates more aggressively and annual deficits start to increase at a accelerating rate, the debt service burden goes up, and that's when deficits and debts become problems. And China has now expressed, to a certain extent, lack of desire to hold U.S. treasuries. The more the dollar falls, the less attractive U.S. dollar-denominated assets become, and we could start running into trouble if the Treasury is a net seller of bonds by letting their holdings roll off. If rates are going up and the dollar is falling, we'll find fewer foreign investors who are willing to hold treasuries. And you could then have that moment that people have talked about in the past but really has yet to materialize, which is a rather rapid depreciation of the dollar, a spike in interest rates, and then you run into a serious economic problem. To the extent that tax reform was not revenue neutral, that's a relatively big deal, and they probably should have found a way in which to make it less onerous in that regard, insofar as deficits will increase. Now, the one thing that we'll see this year is that with the repatriation holiday, $250 billion will come roughly to the U.S. government from cash that's held overseas by U.S. corporations. That may depress the deficit this year, and then in 2019, some are estimating that we could see deficits of annual deficits of $1 trillion going forward, because we already have on average 500 to 600 billion, depending on how strong the economy is. The economy would have to grow extraordinarily quickly to offset the impact of the increase in the deficit from the tax cut. So we might be at an inflection point. I have not, for many years, worried too much about it. There could be, though, as we move forward, a perfect storm of reticence on the part of foreign investors to hold dollar-denominated assets, particularly if we get into trade wars. Holdings of treasuries become a tool for retaliation. China, Japan, whomever's on the other end, Britain. So I think we have to be careful here, and I think there has to be, a relatively deft touch when it comes to trade, that we don't find ourselves in a position of rising interest rates, rising deficits, and having a trade war with our biggest holders of treasuries as the Fed is disgorging treasury bonds at the same time. That would be a perfect storm. That's maybe a year, 2 years out if it happens, but it is a risk that people need to be cognizant of because the dollar's declining so rapidly that might be, as I said earlier, a bit of a canary in the coal mine when it comes to how we finance deficits. And so this would have been a perfect time, instead of just launching tax reform, to use the Simpson-Bowles proposal that was put out several years ago that would have helped redress some of those issues while still providing money for education, infrastructure, retraining, and the like, but that's been thrown out. So we're kind of rolling the dice on this one. It's going to take us 2-3 years to figure out if it's a problem, but it could be, and I wouldn't stop paying attention to that. So on that note, I'm sorry.
Let's give Ron Insana a huge hand for coming out to Des Moines.
Thank you very much. Pleasure chatting with you folks. Thank you.